Mapping your world, yeah. But not in the sense of drawing a physical map, but understanding the many elements that bring your setting to life. Now, there are different ways on how to approach mapping, how cultures and subcultures make your world dynamic, and why even the smallest details contribute to the heartbeat of your story, the plot, and the overall narrative. If you're looking to make your world feel truly alive and lived in, you're in the right place. Because today is all about mapping your world, a guide to building a rich, lived in setting. But, Thomas, what is mapping your world? Well, when it comes to world building, mapping your world isn't about drawing physical maps. It's about creating a comprehensive understanding of different elements that make up your setting. A world should feel lived in and consistent beyond even the narrative you're telling through the character's story. By mapping out key details such as geography, politics, cultures, and the interconnectedness between different regions, you establish a solid foundation that helps your story feel immersive and alive. Think of mapping as establishing the rules and relationships that define your world. For example, how do different regions interact economically or politically? What are the cultural differences between the cities and rural areas? And how might these impact your characters? Are there conflicts, alliances, or trade routes that shape the daily lives of people? These elements might not always make it directly into your narrative, but they influence how your world functions and may make it feel real because even a small interaction could affect that. Now, but Thomas, you might be asking, where do I start? Start by identifying the key elements that literally define your world: major cities, important landmarks, cultural regions, or significant historical events. Now, from there, you need to ask yourself questions that help you understand the relationships between these elements. Who holds the power, right? And how is that power maintained? How do people move between places? How do different areas within your world influence each other? The goal is to understand how your setting operates, its history, and dynamics that affect its characters. Now, believe it or not, you can make all this stuff up. It's writing. Now, the return on the investment, all right, the ROI of putting in the time. Putting in the time, all right, you got to putting time into mapping out your world is an investment with returns. Mapping your world helps you create consistency because if it's written down and you agree to it and you solidify it, and then you start allowing it to influence the narrative of your world, it basically becomes truth, right? It becomes lived, right? It's alive in your world. So this consistency, basically, it's something to fall back on while writing out your narrative in general. Because you could say, oh, this exists. These are things. I wonder how that would influence this smaller town or this bigger city, or, do they have airplanes? When you have a clear sense of how different aspects of your world interconnect, you avoid contradictions or inconsistencies in your storytelling. However, you can have regions that are so far off from each other, or smaller locations that are maybe disconnected from the world, that they don't necessarily understand the larger history that is helping or influencing, I should say, the main populace. But more importantly, it also opens up opportunities for richer storytelling, allowing you to add layers to your plot based on these interconnections, such as the tension between different regions or the impact on historical events that affect literally the present of where you're when you're writing. But additionally, it could affect like the commerce. It could affect, are people starving? Now, ultimately, the process of mapping is about creating a layered, dynamic setting that informs your character's actions, choices, and perspectives, from their religions to their culture to the discrepancies to their prejudices to, do they believe in kings and queens, or do they believe in czars? Do they believe in no leadership? Is it anarchy? It's not just about knowing where things are, but about understanding why they matter and how they influence the emotional truth of your characters. By creating a mental map of your world, complete with relationships, histories, and everyday realities, you make it a place that readers will want to explore and get lost in. Now, you might be saying, Thomas, do I got to do all that? I'll tell you what, there are two approaches to mapping your world. Okay. And the primary ways to approach mapping, they each have their own strengths and weaknesses, of course, but depending on your writing style, let's see what happens. Um, I actually mix both these ways, and we'll get into that. Build as you go. This approach involves letting your world building develop naturally as part of the narrative. Instead of planning every aspect beforehand, you let the needs of your story and characters guide the details you add. This can be a great way to help keep uh, your world building flexible, allowing you to adapt and expand as new ideas arise throughout the writing process. It keeps your world feeling fresh and evolving, with surprises that can even inspire new directions for the story. This approach works particularly well for writers who like to discover their story as they write, keeping the process more intuitive and responsive to the narrative. I love doing this. I sometimes when I just want to change things up or I want to really like explore something, I might just be like I'll just put something there. I'll just create a thing or a character. Maybe I make the character a very specific thing. Um, I might take a concept that I have had in the past and expand on that. And that expansion, so I have the core idea, right? Like I have these I have like a council and or more importantly, I have assassins that work for this council. And while I was reworking the first book of the Maven War saga, the book one, Death of a King, I was like, let me really. I have an opportunity where I can actually explore that working mechanic, and I allowed myself some freedom to add, take away, and stuff like that. And the reason is because you people don't know. You don't know. You don't know you don't know what I had because the book didn't exist. You never, and that's the genius of writing as a writer. Like, it's not you're not Brandon Sanderson where you have all these books and you're like, oh, I got stuff. I have stuff I have to keep in mind because there are so many readers, or the Wheel of Time. Like I have a backlog of history because it exists in the world. When you're writing, especially your first book, you have so much leeway. So whatever it is you sort of worked up and sort of created a foundation, you can allow the build as you go to influence that. Because again, you don't have to stand by it. Just keep in mind, whatever you change might influence the stuff you have rooted in a foundation already. However, that brings us to two: plan before you write. I also do this. I have an extensive history. There are 6 major time events that exist right now that I have extreme detail for. Um, then I have like these smaller events, and then I have like events that are around characters. The Maven Wars happens to be one of the bigger events that exist, and I know basically everything that happens in that time. However, while I'm writing this book, and I know there's going to be 5 books in the first series, 5 books in the second series, 5 books in the third series. They're all contained series, by the way. They're all 5-book contained series, but it is for the Maven Wars. I'm allowing myself some malleability to build as I go. So I'll add and subtract ideas. New characters are coming into play. Older characters that I really love, I'm reworking a little bit, or maybe I don't like a character that, like, there's a character that existed. Uh, it was a character that kind of like was friends with this other character named Titan, and I was like, I don't like that character. They're just a, they're just somebody who hops around. So I was like, but Titan was important, so I was like, let's get rid of the character. So by no one knowing what your books are, or even if they did, let's say they knew 1 or 2 books, you still have the ability to build as you go. However, plan before you write is all about setting these broad stroke foundations that help you. And in this approach specifically, you would dedicate some time to mapping out key elements of your world before starting the narrative. This doesn't mean detailing literally every single aspect, but instead focusing on the elements that will support the narrative specifically. This is an important thing about writing. There is, let me design every single species that will ever exist or has exist or will exist in my world. And then there's what species, I call them species, they're what races. I call them species though, because like the Valus, the Chem Valus are very distinct to say the Hamarans, the Hamarian people versus say the Minotaurs versus say the Akids or the Regans or whatever like that. Like they're all species. Okay, they're all very much their own species. Anyway, so I said to myself, there's going to be X amount of species within this first book, but it's exploring mostly the Hamaran tribes. They're not really tribes, but they're tribes. They're like groups of people. And then the Hamarans that decided that they didn't want to live on the land; they wanted to live in the cities and the villages and the towns and become assimilated into the populace. So there's that narrative. So they're literally the same species, but some live on the land, off the land, and some live in the men of stone, stone and walls. Then the Valus are sort of like the higher up species. They are the people that sort of they're the first creatures ever created that have the ability to think, right? So but it wasn't really their story, so I didn't go too deep into that in the first book. It's all really about the Hamarans and their history, specifically for this group of people. So I didn't waste time going, well, let me go deep into the Valus. And that's what you have to remember. Don't go too deep into what's not important to the narrative. Just set a foundation, a broad, strong foundation for what is needed, and then allow yourself to build as you go. But you do want to think about the geography, the power dynamics, cultural elements, the histories, right? For example, I wanted the Naradita to be a culture of people, right? There's a thing called the 5 spirit tribes. And I wanted a history to that. And I knew what the history of that was. It's called the Battle of the 5, right? And but the Naradita themselves, as the other tribes too, I think I've talked about this in another video, but men and women can do whatever they want. And what that means is if a man or a woman in that tribe want to be warriors, they just need to pass the trials. If they want to be farmers, they could, like, they're not dictate, like there is a leader, there is a council, there is a group of people that sort of lead the Naradita, but you earn those spots, right? Like through basically the elders. It's the elders. Right? But everyone sort of like has their thing, but no one's like, well, you are this. Like you can become something, and you're supported, and it's like open communication. And one of the other things is I made sure the Naradita in my mind were the educated, like the philosophical people, and educated, and the people in the cities are, they want money. That's why they're there. They want money. They want wealth. They want power. They want, right. But what do? They're the men of stone and walls. They build these prisons for themselves because they're right. But the people who live openly and freely, they live off the land, and they worship the gods, which do actually exist in my world. They hang out, with people, but sometimes they don't know that they're hanging out with a god. They just, But anyway, so those were things that I had to lay the foundation for. And you need to think about those. How much of that is important to the narrative, and how much are you going to explore of that? That also doesn't mean that, well, I worked this out, so I have to talk about it. No, as long as you know it, then you create the rules for it, right? And you don't have to explain it. It's sort of like reading the first chapter, Bran, in Game of Thrones, where they mention the Night Watch, but they don't really explain it in the first chapter because they don't have to. But they say the word, so that's a world building cultural reference. So you can do that. But planning ahead can provide a sense of stability for you and a consistency that helps avoid potential plot holes or inconsistencies to the culture, to the world, to the rules. It allows you to create a strong foundation that your characters can interact with, and it gives you a clear understanding of your world's mechanics from the outset. However, it's important to remember that you don't need to know every single thing, just enough to give your world depth and believability and for you to play off of. Both approaches, I will say, have value. It's really up to you to decide which one works for you best. However, again, I use both. And that's why you may even find a mix of both approaches suits your needs. Some elements you plan ahead, and some you play with and break up. Now, what about the micro? Now, remember, the micro is as important as the macro. Even in areas where a particular way of life, government, or culture is dominant, there are often smaller subcultures that add richness and complexity to the setting. This concept is important for creating a world that feels lived in and diverse. Think of a major city like New York. While it has a distinct New York way of life, it's also home to countless people from different backgrounds, each contributing their own customs, cultures, languages, and traditions. This subculture coexists. These subcultures coexist, overlap, and influence one another, given the city its unique, multifaceted character. On the other hand, consider a more homogeneous region like parts of the Midwest or Deep South in the United States, such as the Dakotas or West Virginia. While these areas may seem to have more unified cultural identity, there are still smaller pockets of diversity, of diverse communities within different traditions, histories, and ways of life. However, these nuances help to break stereotypes and add depth to your world building, ensuring that even within seemingly uniform settings, there is a sense of variety and complexity. The big difference is, Kentucky is not going to have the same atmosphere as New York City. There might be cultures broken up within those communities, but at the same time, it's not going to be the same impact as New York. So you need to understand these things, because when mapping out your world, think about how different cultures and subcultures interact, interconnect, coexist, and how their unique identities help to shape the overall atmosphere of a region. These layers make your setting feel more real, offering opportunities for tension, alliances, and unexpected dynamics that can enrich your narrative. Now, the heartbeat of your world is all about mapping, is what, or I should say this, mapping your world out is what gives it a heartbeat, an existence, a life. It's not about the big flashy elements, but the smaller, varied details that breathe life into your setting. It's the little things, like the spices people use in their cooking, the way different regions celebrate their festivals, or the nuances of governance in various areas. It's not just about big fancy buildings. It's about understanding why that building exists, who built it, how they built it, and what it represents today, especially if we look at something like Rome and the arena, the Colosseum. Has it, and you look at these buildings and you say to yourself, has it become a symbol of something, or perhaps just an overlooked structure that people pass by without much thought? And that happens. The Colosseum, everybody wants to see, but there's other buildings there there's apartment buildings in Rome that are so old, it's ridiculous, right? But they're just like, I live here. These details, the layers of history, culture, and individual stories create the world that feels lived in. It's when the world building is a part of the existence of the characters and maybe spices up, gives it a little something, something to the narrative that the world starts feeling lived in. Now, these details, the layers, the cultures, all that, you want that so it feels lived in because they are what makes your world dynamic, a place that evolves and carries with it a sense of time and purpose. In some cases, porpoise. The more you explore these different facets, the more your world transforms into a rich, complex tapestry that your readers will want to explore because they want to know the little difference. I have trolls, and they are not trolls that you would see in a traditional book. There's something about them, and every single beta reader and every single alpha reader that read was like, I want to know more about those trolls. And I was like, great, that's what I wanted. And the trolls are in the second book more, but I wanted them in the first book to be something that stood out. And I'm glad I trusted my instinct with that. But I do want to say this. Remember that it's the variations and the time you put into understanding even the smallest elements that will make your world's heartbeat felt by the reader. And with that said, final thoughts. World building is an exciting journey that allows you to think outside the box and shape a world that's uniquely yours. The process takes time, and that's perfectly okay because each piece you add helps you discover your voice as a writer and the world you create. Remember, it is made up, and that's the beauty of it. You have the freedom to change, adapt, and evolve your world as you go. Don't be afraid to experiment, to explore different possibilities, and have fun along the way. Every little detail you put into your world adds richness, and every mistake is just another step in refining your vision. Let your imagination run wild and enjoy the wonderful adventure of creating something entirely yours and unique. It's okay if the birds don't have eyes, but they all listen through, right? It's okay. Maybe birds don't have feathers. Maybe dogs are rhinos in your world, right? But they don't look like rhinos. They look like someone else. Like, you can literally just do whatever you want. All right, next video in this series, we're going to talk about creating conflict and tension in your world through world building. We're going to allow that the history of the worlds and stuff like that. All right, question. How do you approach mapping out your world? Do you prefer to build as you go or plan ahead before writing? What unique details have you added to your world that gives it its own heartbeat? Let us know in the comments below. And if you haven't done so already, but you like what you've been watching, please subscribe and hit the bell icon so you don't miss out. All right, I guess that's it. As always, keep developing the right mindset. I'll see you next time. Bye.